Hi, and welcome to the lecture on social learning and differential association theories. Social learning and differential association theories come from the place of saying that crime is not something that people are biologically programmed to commit, all right? They don't see it as really having much relationship at all to biology, nor do social learning and differential association theorists think that crime is a product of being poor or having few opportunities. Rather, social learning theory and social learning theorists think that crime is something that happens because we learn how to commit crime from other people, our parents, our siblings, and our friends. And that if we have parents and siblings or friends who show us how to commit crime, we will then often end up committing crime ourselves. Alternatively, if we have parents, siblings, and friends who show us ways to fill our time that don't include committing crime, we are less likely to spend any amount of our lives committing crime. We're more likely to spend our lives doing things that are positive for ourselves and for others.
Edward Sutherland, who died in 1950, was the first to develop social learning theories. This theoretical inheritance was continued by Cressy and Luckenbill. Sutherland was interested in white-collar crime, and his study of criminals who were not poor, so they were not under financial strain, and who had not grown up in communities that were strained, made him think that crime was not the result of some problem that existed in the lower classes. Rather, Sutherland argued that people learned how to be criminals from other criminals. Sutherland termed this learning of crime differential association. He did not specify how this learning happened, however. Here's a picture of Edward Sutherland. Later on, Burgess and Akers alone reformulated differential association theories to explicitly consider how culture teaches and reinforces behaviors using psychological studies such as operant conditioning, and ultimately renaming the theory social learning theory. More recently, this theory has been expanded to mesh it with social structures, looking at how social structures such as neighborhood poverty affects social learning. This is to say that social learning and differential association theories both operate on the individual levels, and we will cover both of them in this lecture somewhat separately. Differential association theory has 9 different principles associated with it. The first one is that criminal behavior is learned. The second one is that criminal behavior is learned in interactions with other people through a process of communication. The third part of differential association theory is that the principal part of the learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. This is because Sutherland is from the symbolic interactionist school, and he believes learning definitions concerning one's behavior is crucial to the learning process. He says that although the people we associate with are a key factor in the learning process, our interpretations of their behavior and their expressed attitudes or definitions are the key to determining the probability of committing a crime. The fourth element of differential association theory is that when criminal behavior is learned, the learning includes techniques of committing the crime, which are sometimes very complicated and sometimes very simple, and the specific direction of motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes that accompany committing the crime. In other words, the motivation to commit crime comes from how a person views legal codes. Individuals who view the law positively will not commit crime. Those who learn to view the law in a negative manner will be more inclined to commit crime. So if you don't respect the law or don't think the law is fair, or hear your friends and your parents talking negatively about the law, you'll be less inclined to respect the law and more inclined to commit crime. Ultimately, whether a person does or does not decide to commit a crime depends on how his or her view of the law stands. For example, a definition of the law favorable to crime would be, it is okay to cheat if you can get away with it. An unfavorable definition to crime would be, cheating is wrong, no matter what. The fifth element of differential association theory is that the specific direction of motives and drives is learned from definitions of legal code as unfavorable or favorable. The sixth element of differential association theory is that a person becomes delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to violating laws over definitions unfavorable to violating laws. This varies along 4 different dimensions: frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Frequency is how often one is exposed to a definition favorable or unfavorable to crime. Duration refers to the amount of time a person is exposed to a definition. Early definitions take precedence or have more influence over later definitions. Finally, definitions from those we are emotionally attached to have a more intense relationship or a more intense hold over us than other definitions. Definitions will also carry more weight if a person is exposed to them frequently. Over a long period of time and from an early age, and if they come from a significant person in their life. So older siblings, parents, and other relatives have a tremendous amount of sway. However, Sutherland argued specifically that it is exposure to the definitions of crime, not the individuals themselves, not criminals themselves, that is significant in causing one to become delinquent. Finally, differential associations may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. The process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminals and anti-criminal patterns involves all of the mechanisms that are involved in any other learning scenario. And finally, while criminal behavior is an expression of general needs and values, it is not explained by those general needs and values, since non-criminal behavior is an expression of the same needs and values. Sutherland envisioned that there would be a formula to predict whether a person would be a criminal based on his or her ratio of definitions favorable to crime relative to his or her definitions unfavorable to crime. He also thought that the definitions could vary crime by crime. In other words, a person could believe that shoplifting was acceptable, but armed robbery was not. He thought that this was due to groups or areas having norms that make law violation okay, like social disorganization theory states, and he termed this differential social organization as the theory utilized both social structures, community characteristics, and social processes, like learning. This also accounted for subcultural differences in crime rates, but the majority of the theory focused on social learning and social processes. Differential association became one of the best known criminological theories, but its concepts are vague. What are, quote, definitions favorable to crime, unquote? How would you even measure them? Do we only learn by seeing others' behavior directly and imitating them, or can we learn in other ways, like through television or the internet.
Ferguson, Akers, expanded differential association theory to take advantage of advances in psychological learning principles. This resulted in social learning theory.
Social learning theory focuses on four main concepts: definitions, differential association, differential reinforcement, and imitation. Definitions are orientations, attitudes, and rationalizations that label a behavior as right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. Definitions can be general, violence is wrong, or specific, fighting back to protect yourself is okay on the playground. The stronger one's definitions that deem illegal acts as acceptable, the more likely one is to engage in them. So if you have a very strong definition of acceptable behavior, it's acceptable to fight back all the time on the playground. It is, according to social learning theory, that definition is likely to give a child lots of leeway so that they are always fighting back on the playground. Whether they are simply like poked by someone or if they are hit and severely beaten by someone, they're likely to respond by fighting back in all of those scenarios. Okay. Differential association refers to the people with whom one comes into contact. Early in life, the family is this primary group. Peer influences increase in the teen years, so as you age, your friends become more important. Finally, friends and family and teachers and coaches and neighbors and authority figures and even the media can be models in later life. Differential reinforcement is the balance of anticipated or actual rewards and punishments that follow or are consequences of a behavior. The likelihood of a response can be increased through either the introduction of positive stimulus or the removal of negative stimuli. Negative reinforcement would increase the likelihood of a response by removing some unpleasant stimulus. In your car, for example, fastening your seatbelt makes the evil buzzing tone stop. It revokes the negative stimulus. Beep, beep, beep. Stops when you fasten your seatbelt. Positive stimuli refer to things like obtaining the approval of others or gaining food or money or positive feelings. Reinforcements that are positive or negative can vary in their amount, their frequency, and their probability. A reward is more likely to reinforce behavior if it is large, frequent, and/or probable. Likewise, punishments are likely to reduce behavior if they are large, frequent, and probable. Akers predicts that a person's criminal or law-abiding behavior will be most like that of his or her close friends or family, because they are the most frequent and regular sources of reinforcement. Imitation is another reason our behavior is frequently like that of our friends and family. Seeing an older sibling drink might result in a child modeling that behavior. Akers argues that imitation is probably more important for the initiation of a behavior than the persistence of a behavior. Think of Joe Camel, the one-time mascot for Camel cigarettes, and how many kids said that they started to smoke because Joe Camel was cool and they wanted to be cool like Joe the Camel. This is saying that imitation and Joe the Camel got kids to start smoking, They continued smoking after that on their own accord. In total, think of social learning theory as suggesting that imitation and social reinforcement are the two processes that explain why our behavior is usually similar to that of our friends and family. Akers has revised and expanded social learning theory to consider the roles of social structures in crime. In the late 1990s, Akers proposed that social learning theory should be integrated with macro-level theories of crime, meaning that the elements of social structures such as class, race, and ethnicity, gender, age, and marital status all provide the general learning context in which the social learning principles of differential association, definitions, differential reinforcement, and imitation operate. So a teen in the inner city would be more likely to be exposed to and model delinquent behavior than a kid from a rural farm. Next, we're going to go and talk about concepts and measurement issues in differential association and social learning theories. When we talk about hypotheses of differential association theory, the four main hypotheses of this theory are as follows. Hypothesis 1 is that individuals are more likely to commit crime if they spend time with friends who commit crime. This hypothesis is supported in part by the finding that delinquent juveniles are likely to have friends who are also delinquent juveniles. Hypothesis 2. Individuals are more likely to commit crime if they spend time with family members who commit crime. This hypothesis has been tested by far fewer studies than the first hypothesis. It is much more common for hypotheses and research to look at the relationships of juveniles and juveniles regarding delinquency than it has been for research studies to look at family members and how they are affecting juvenile delinquents deviancy. Hypothesis 3. A person is more likely to be delinquent if he or she is exposed to definitions favorable to crime by friends or family, especially if those definitions are long-standing, frequent, begin early in life, and come from respected sources. And hypothesis 4. The association with delinquent definitions has to precede delinquency rather than follow it. In order for there to be a causal arrow, the association with delinquent definitions has to come before the delinquent behavior. One long-standing criticism is that Sutherland did not specify the content of definitions favorable to crime. Think of what are favorable or unfavorable definitions of crime. How would you know? How would you measure such a thing? Differential association theory states that people will commit crime when they hold definitions that are favorable to crime. But we don't know what those definitions are to a large extent. Sykes and Matz argue that people use quote-unquote techniques of neutralization to reduce the wrongfulness of crime. That is to say that in people's definitions of crime, they minimize or neutralize the negative effects of these crimes so that they can more easily, at least in a moral fashion, engage in these crimes. These techniques of neutralization are as follows. 1. Denial of responsibility. If you've committed a crime and you say, "It's not my fault that I ran the stop sign," or "It was an accident that I drove through that red light," or "My family was starving, so I had to steal." These are all techniques of neutralization that fall under the denial of responsibility category. The second technique is denial of injury. This is denying that people were hurt. You hear it when you hear people say, "Oh, I was just borrowing the car." Not, "Oh, I forgot to tell you that I was taking the car and thus you thought the car was stolen." Or, "Boys will be boys, girls know that," if someone is excusing or trying to excuse sexual violence. The third type of technique of neutralization is denial of victim or victimhood. This type of neutralization comes up when there's a claim that the victim, quote, "had it coming," unquote, or ignores the victim's right. When you hear somebody say it was kill or be killed, that's an example of there being a denial of the victim, or, quote, "the company makes billions, I can steal $5, unquote. That's another example of denial of victimization. The fourth technique of neutralization is condemnation of the condemner. This is what happens when the person who commits the crime said the world is corrupt and the only way to manage it is to commit crime. So if you hear someone say, quote, "I was never going to be able to get a good job with the system so corrupt, so I had to deal drugs," that's an example of a condemnation of the condemner technique of neutralization. Finally, people sometimes use the technique to appeal to higher loyalties. This is what's going on when someone says, quote, "I had to be my friend's wingman in a gunfight, so that's why I was out there with a gun shooting." All right? These favorable definitions of crime are not alone. Other researchers have looked at favorable and unfavorable definitions by writing statements about police and laws and asking survey participants which of these statements they agree with. In one study, these statements included, quote, "policemen try to give all kids a break," unquote, which is a general statement, and, quote, "sales of cigarettes should be outlawed," unquote, which is a specific statement. If a person believes that any law violation is okay, will he or she believe all law violations are okay? If the questions asked are about general crimes, such as "policemen try to give all kids a break," or "policemen always try to arrest only hardened criminals," so if a person is asked about general crimes and a person thinks one general crime is okay, does it mean that a person will think that all law breaking is okay? If the crimes the person agrees with are specific and a person disagrees, so a person disagrees with the statement, it is okay for men to have sex with women without the consent of the women involved. That's an example of a specific statement. If someone disagrees with that, does that mean that we are perhaps just asking the wrong questions? That's possible. Can a person find theft to be okay, but armed robbery to be wrong? It's another question. Also, Sutherland predicted crime would happen only when a person has an excess of definitions favorable to crime. So, what is an excess in this case? Also, this means that we need to figure out what definitions are favorable and what definitions are unfavorable to crime. Measure each individual's propensity for each of them, calculate the ratio, and weight each of these definitions based on frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. In short, this would be really hard. Researchers have tried to measure this through SEM, or structural equation modeling, using large-scale survey data of youth and by creating categories of respondents, also from large-scale survey data of youth. Both of these approaches had their own problems, and in undertaking any of these three approaches, researchers had to assume that as pro-crime definitions increase, anti-crime definitions decrease, and that may not actually be true. Finally, we also have to question, is Sutherland's sources of definitions true? He says that individuals acquire their definitions mostly from friends and their family, but what about other possibilities, like television or the internet or other forms of social media? Finally, although many studies claim to test differential association, some test quote-unquote differential association, but do so without having any source or way to measure the definitions of crime. This is a problem because it is a core part of the theory, and if you run into an article that claims to be testing differential associations but does not do any form of measurement of the definitions of crime, be very wary of that article. Differential association is the process that Sutherland argued is basically how we learn definitions. He said one's friends affect what a person thinks about crime and what that person ultimately defines as criminal. Friends model and reinforce behavior. Many studies measure this by asking youths how many crimes each of their friends has committed within the past few months. We know that teens who are delinquent are more likely to have delinquent friends. It's one of the major findings of criminological studies. But such measurements of delinquency assume all crime is equal. Is having 10 friends, each of whom has stolen an item under $5 in the past 6 months, the same as having 10 friends, each of whom has murdered someone in the past 6 months? Studies that are assessing criminality typically assume this is true, but it may not actually be the case. Finally, although we know that peer approval is important, we know it is typically the most effective pressure in getting someone to do something, especially to commit crime. We don't know if peer pressure is effective at stopping delinquency. Peer pressure is not, we know that peer pressure is not as effective at stopping delinquency. Regardless, these effects may be due to projection, in part, rather than peer pressure directly. Projection is the tendency to believe that the people we like will also think what we do. So if Jim and Bob are friends, Jim will overestimate the degree to which Bob agrees with him on issues. People project their feelings onto those with whom they are close. So this means that, for instance, if Cindy and Julie are both in middle school, and Cindy thinks it's cool to steal candy from a teacher, she will automatically assume that Julie thinks it is cool to steal candy from the teacher too. And although she may say, if she gets caught stealing candy, that Julie pressured her to steal the candy, Cindy may have just been attributing her thought that stealing candy is cool to Julie, and Julie was actually not pressuring her, but Cindy was suffering from overestimation of thinking that her friend was in agreement with her and thus projecting her feelings onto her friend. The other problem that peer influence studies have is one that Gottfredson and Hirschi discussed. This means that by measuring friends' delinquency, the researcher is actually measuring the respondent's own delinquency rate. Because teen crime is typically committed in groups, whether they are small or large. This also leads to the question of whether it is peers' attitudes or peers' behaviors which has more effect on the deviance of their friends. Generally, we assume that behavior has more influence than attitude, but more research is really needed here. Finally, we need to understand more about the relationships between peers, particularly young peers. Does how close a friend someone is matter on how they affect a person's behavior? The same question could also be asked for groups. Is how close you are to the group more or less likely to influence how much pressure a group can exert on your behavior? If we flip over now and look at the social learning theory and social learning hypotheses, hypothesis 5 is that criminal behavior is more likely to occur if it is reinforced. So crime is more likely if the person believes it will be rewarded and not punished. Hypothesis 6 is that those who are rewarded for criminal behavior are more likely to commit crime again. And hypothesis 7 is that those who are punished for criminal behavior are less likely to commit crime again. Finally, hypothesis 8 says that a person is more likely to commit crime if he or she sees others committing crime through imitation. Differential reinforcement is a significant difference between differential association and social learning theories. Akers' social learning theory suggests that crime will be more likely when it is reinforced by friends' reactions and expectations. Most social learning studies try to measure reinforcement and find that when crime is viewed positively, the criminal is more likely to repeat it. Akers finds this through the outcome of a survey of drug and alcohol use by 2,400 students in the Midwest. Other studies have found concurrent findings, but it is problematic that some studies consider positive reactions and other studies consider both positive and negative reactions by those who surround the respondents. Studies need to be consistent in what they measure, whether they're measuring positive reactions or both positive and negative reactions. Studies should also try to measure the non-social effects of criminal behavior, the quote-unquote rush from committing a crime or the effects of doing drugs. Finally, more studies need to examine the effects of imitation. Imitation has been found to have weak effects through studies that look at social learning. We are not quite sure how imitation works. Is it important in learning the crime? Is it key in the beginning to committing crime? We don't know. Better models of differential reinforcement are needed. Originally, imitation was measured through a survey that asked the following. Check yes or no whether your best male friend smokes or whether your best female friend smokes, or both. Later, this has evolved into questions such as the following. How many people do you know and admire, parents, friends, and others, that you have observed smoking? Social learning theories are intended to explain all types of crime. But how crime is measured If stealing a 2-pack of gum is a crime and rape is a crime and they're both just counted as crimes, well, what does that really say about the theory? If you're defining some crime, like underage drinking, into categories, and you've based those categories into 3 parts: alcohol, those who do not try alcohol versus those that try alcohol and just try a little bit of it, versus those that get drunk, and you classify those that try it but don't get drunk as quote-unquote non-criminals, then your definition contradicts legal definitions of crime. So you've given variability in your definitions, and you're accurately reflecting, or at least mostly accurately reflecting, variability in your sample, but you've created categories or perhaps created categorical labels that are different from what the law states. Much of the research on differential association and social learning theories have been done using cross-sectional data. So that's data that looks at information gathered from a wide variety of individuals, typically over the same age, but on or near approximately the same date. This type of study only gathers data once in a person's life. Since these theories posit that learning has to happen before the crime is committed or before crimes are committed, we have to ask ourselves, are cross-sectional studies the best methodology for getting at causation? Because causation cannot be established through these studies since they only collect data at one point in time. We can only show correlation. We don't know which comes first in these studies. People's interaction with individuals who hold definitions of crime that are likely to support criminal behaviors, or the criminal behaviors themselves. Since we're only taking measurement at one point in time, we can't assess that. Now, a type of study that does a better job of assessing that are called longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies have tested the precepts of social learning theories and found support for them. Longitudinal studies require surveying the same set of people at least 2 different points in time, and thus establishing through these surveys what event predates the other event. Needless to say, longitudinal studies are far more expensive and more difficult to conduct than cross-sectional studies. However, some people have criticized longitudinal studies for being too simplistic as well. These people would argue that we learn crime from our friends and that our friends learn crime from us. And so sticking a causal arrow from our friends' criminal behaviors and saying that they lead to our own criminal behavior is inaccurate. However, more research needs to be done to test this theory. Finally, we need to look at future research avenues. Further research needs to employ modeling strategies that illustrate the dynamic processes of relationships. In other words, modeling strategies that aren't just one-directional, that can explain and account for interaction between individuals that goes back and forth. Next, Sutherland's definitions must be clarified and addressed. Also, Although it is consistent with social learning theories that juvenile delinquents associate with other juvenile delinquents, other theories could explain this phenomenon as well. Perhaps delinquents seek each other out. Perhaps delinquents provide more opportunities for delinquency. Research needs to clarify the roles of delinquent peers and peer groups in the delinquency process. Research also needs to better measure the impact of delinquent family members on would-be delinquents. Finally, the combination of social control and social learning concepts needs to be explored and pushed to see if the individual level aspects of social learning theories can be combined with the macro level processes of the social control theories.
The lecture questions for the week are as follows. 1. What are the major concepts of social learning theory? 2. What does Akers' social learning theory add to Sutherland's differential association theory? 3. Why may differential association theory be untestable? 4. What is the Lucifer effect? Why is it important to social learning theory?